Yeah, we'll have a little bit different flavor on it today. We'll have a look at kind of where all this is coming from, the pushes and the pulls and the whys of so at least some of why we're moving in the direction that we are. I've got a quick slide here on quick thank you to our member companies that make this possible. We at the CNCA are the Regional Cement Association, somewhat analogous to PCA on the national level, but we are on the local level for California and Nevada. Here are the things that we'll take a look at today as far as perception of our industry, the needs of various groups of owners, designers, etc. Some legislation that we're seeing out in California, as well as some local codes and where you might be able to find some more information about things that might be coming down the pike in your neck of the woods. So of course, we've got the perception of the cement industry's role in global warming. You hear quotes often attributing 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or 9 or 10% of the CO2 in the world to cement production. Of course, our favorite last year, The Guardian, and their Concrete Week and Cement Week, calling us out as the most destructive material on Earth. The reality, as Rick mentioned, I think is found in the newest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that attributed about 4% of the total fossil CO2 emissions in the cement from the cement industry, and they say, quote from their report here, that the uptake from carbonization is about half of the carbon emissions from cement production. Now, I didn't read real deeply into all of the assumptions that went into that. This report is not quite 4,000 pages, and I have not yet found the time to get into the details. Maybe somebody else can give me the Cliff Notes version of that. Here in California, we represent about 1.8% of the state's CO2 emissions. The cement industry does. You can see transportation is the lion's share of emissions. We sure do love our cars out here in the Golden State. We have some internal needs. Our industry here in California is committed to carbon neutrality by 2045. We didn't pick that date to one up the PCA and their plan for 2050. You'll see why here in a minute. We have just recently, as of Friday, actually, got Portland limestone cement approved by our state DOT here. So that's available now for future projects. And also they introduced a directive allowing existing projects to switch over to Portland limestone cement. So that's a nice deal there for us. Our report, our commitment to carbon neutrality by 2045 was issued back in March, and you can find it on our website at cncement.org if you'd like to take a look. We've got needs, being expressed from private owners. Pulled a few examples of this from the web, general looking around on the internet. Facebook's new headquarters in the Bay Area there in California runs on a 100% renewable energy and is a LEED Platinum certified building. The Apple headquarters in Cupertino, $5 billion construction project, is LEED Platinum. Google now has over 12 million square feet of LEED Platinum certified buildings and more all the time. These big tech companies, big industries are looking for LEED certified buildings, for lower carbon emissions, for lower energy usages, and they're driving that demand to their designers, to their engineers, to their architects, et cetera, and the demand is being met. Building green is a pretty big business. This source I found from Statista.com estimates that the size of the U.S. green building market's $81 billion a year. Some of these contractors here, I'm going to thank James Bogdan for this information over at NRMCA. Some of these big, general contractors here, you see Turner Group and AECOM, each with over 1,000 green accredited staff on their payrolls and doing big business in the multi-billions of dollars a year in construction. So, this is big business. And if for no other reason, then you'd like to be a part of it, just know that there are a lot of dollars out there for you if you are. We've got a big push from public owners. I put these state flags over on the right side here. States of Washington, Colorado, California, Minnesota all have some kind of a buy clean provision for some materials as part of their state laws. We're seeing cities and counties and states coming up with their own sustainability plan. Up at the Los Angeles County plan on the front here. And this is, providing impetus, providing direction for the folks making decisions within those agencies to reach for lower carbon solutions, to reach for LEED certifications, to reach for Envision sustainability certifications. Some more information here from James. This, what we call the MUSH sector, municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals, are sometimes at least some overlap with the SLED agencies, state, local, and education. Those types of clients, those types of owners are looking for these types of buildings, right? Low carbon buildings, sustainable buildings, low energy buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And we have an opportunity to provide them with what they're looking for. We've got a push on the designer side. American Institute of Architects has their 2030 challenge, challenge their members to produce new buildings, developments, and major renovations to be carbon neutral by 2030. From the Structure Engineers Institute from ASCE, they've committed, and the Structure Engineers Associations, they've committed to having net zero by 2050. So just another example of the direction that the designers are moving in. I've got so many animations on this slide. When we combine the goals of the SE 2050 plan and the AIA 2050 plan, we can see it here graphically, how these things just continue to march downward over year after year after year. That's what these owners are looking for. That's what their designers are delivering. Now we'll take a look at some environmental legislation that we have here in California. You might find some things interesting here, and it might be a harbinger of what's coming in your markets. We'll start off with the California Air Resource Board, established back in the Reagan era. Reagan was the governor here in California before he became president in 1980. Now, this is the clean air agency in the state. Their main function for many years was essentially regulating tailpipe emissions from vehicles. You might be interested in knowing that California is the only state that can set its own vehicle emissions regulations. For a long time, you might have opened the hood on a vehicle and seen a sticker about it being 49 state compliant, or maybe a sticker that said it was California compliant, which then would mean California and the other 49 states. I think anymore, California's tailpipe emissions and federal tailpipe emissions are pretty well in alignment. You're not seeing a lot of differences in those vehicles now. Much later on, Assembly Bill 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, was passed, and this mandated that the state move back to 2000 levels of emissions by 2010 and to 1990 emissions levels by 2020, and then to get to 80% below those by 2050. And as part of this, it authorized the California Air Resource Board that we looked at on the previous slide to institute a cap and trade program as a reduction to apply a price to carbon in an effort to reduce carbon outputs. So we put the state on a trajectory that looks like this. You see this inflection point at 2020, and then a more downward trend below that. I'm happy to say that here in the state, we did in fact hit that number by 2020, and now we've moved beyond that and are continuing our march downward in emissions. The cap and trade program is a pretty interesting one. There's a California participates with Ontario, Canada, I believe it is. So essentially, the state's large emitters are regulated by the California Air Resource Board. They have to either purchase allowances to emit those tons of carbon, or in the case of the cement industry and some others, when it's recognized that that industry is subject to leakage, essentially the concept of if an entity or an industry is over-regulated in California, well, they'll just produce cement someplace else and ship it in from China or Vietnam or India or Arizona, other exotic places like that. And, offset it that way, where the California Air Resource Board doesn't have a lot of reach and control. So every year, the number of available credits goes down. That's essentially the cap. And the credits can be bought and sold and traded. And so that's the trade aspect of it. They're fungible. The prices are going up on this. The floor price increases, currently $17. But in the August 2021 auction, the average price for current vintage allowances was $23.30. So 2 months ago, they generated about $1.6 billion in emission credits and almost $20 billion there since its inception. So this is a pretty big business as well. And it's pretty easy to see that if our industry can't stay underneath the caps, we get out of the realm of allocations, the price of the cement would start to come up very quickly if the industry had to start purchasing these allowances. And this is what it looks like in a graphical sense, as far as what's out there year over year. This program currently expires in 2030. I have no illusions that that's going to be the case. Once these things are in place, they do tend to hang around. Then in 2016, along came Senate Bill 32, which added another checkpoint, said that we're going to be 40% below the 1990 emissions by 2030. So put us on a new trajectory with a little kink in it there. So that was a strange thing, right? To have a very steep trajectory between 2020 and 2030, but then a relaxed trajectory between 2030 and 2050. Not to worry, along comes Executive Order B5518 and a nice new graphic from Stanford University. That backed up the mandate to get to carbon neutrality to 2045. And so that's why the carbon neutrality plan for our industry in California has 2045 as its end goal, and not 2050, like the national plan does. We'll take a look at a couple of bills here that have passed and one that hasn't, that regulate GHGs. Assembly Bill 262, called Buy Clean California Act from 4 years ago, did initially have cement and concrete as one of the materials that was covered by this legislation. We were able to get it removed because this would be very difficult to implement. It currently covers just 4 materials you see here, essentially rebar, flat glass, mineral wool insulation, and structural steel. And there's a handful of subcategories underneath those materials. It's about 12 different kinds of EPDs. And the Department of General Services was tasked with establishing maximum acceptable GWPs for those materials. And so now any state-funded project that incorporates those materials, the materials to be incorporated have to be submitted along with an EPD showing that they're under kind of the maximum GWP level for those. The limits get reviewed every year and can be adjusted, but they can only ever be adjusted downward. That's part of the law. This has been difficult for them to implement. And as such, another bill was passed just this most recent session, kicking the implementation date out by another 18 months to summer of next year. And we will see whether they're able to get this in line, get this working or not. Another interesting one here, Senate Bill 778, Buy Clean Concrete. Despite concrete and cement being removed from the 262 bill that we looked at a moment ago, there still is a desire in Sacramento to regulate that material. So this bill came out, which would have rolled out a maximum GWP for concrete. It would have required the California Air Resource Board come up with different classes, potentially compare them to regional averages. Those might have been the NRMCA regional averages, although it wasn't very specific in the proposed legislation. Interesting thing in this bill, it also required all state agencies in California to use only performance-based specifications for concrete. And so while as an industry we support that, guess who is not quite ready for that? Our friends over at Caltrans. This would have required them to generate performance-based specs for all their concrete, and they'd have had about 6 months to do it. And I think there's some folks on the line here who have some experience working with Caltrans, and they know that that was probably not a reality. But the biggest pushback on this came from the state, from the contractors in the state. This would have required them to submit their concrete suppliers and EPD information as part of their bid package, and they could be disqualified. Their bids could be disqualified if concrete proposed to be used was over that maximum GWP. It would also allow for a bonus potential if you were below your competitor's GWP. So that's pretty difficult. Fortunately, this bill was withdrawn by the author, Josh Becker, but we know it's going to come back in the next session. And we've indicated, of course, that we're happy to participate on helping to craft this legislation. And the most recent one, which is now law, signed by our governor here just a few weeks ago, does specifically govern greenhouse gases from cement plants. It requires that cement plants achieve net zero or net negative emissions by 2045, requires our friends at the Air Resource Board that we talked about earlier to have a plan in place in about 2 years. It also has that same checkpoint that SB 32 had in it for that 40% below 2019 levels by 2030, and also specifically mentions imported cement. Now, you might think that this would be the kind of thing that we'd pull out all the stops on to try to put a stop to, right? Who in their right mind wants their industry specifically mentioned in legislation and specifically governed and limited in terms of what the emissions can do? But you'd be wrong. We actually are supportive of this measure. We helped Senator Becker craft the language in the measure. We testified on behalf of it in committee and celebrated it when it passed. And you might be ready to call us crazy out here in California, all the granola eating fruits and nuts. But the reason for it is this. This is an excerpt from our carbon neutrality plan. And all of these check marks that you see within the boxes that require legislative assistance or require regulatory assistance, in other words, things that are not necessarily within our own control here in our industry, by making the mandate that our industry become carbon neutral by 2045, we have essentially been able to put in place, a law that will require other parts of the state government to help us achieve our goals. I mentioned at the top, Portland limestone cement's already in place at a state level, so maybe I could have made that box a little bit smaller. But we have lots of other things, of course, that we're working on. I haven't yet had an opportunity to read the PCA's the plan that Rick was talking about, but I suspect that we'll see a lot of similar things in both plans. Also want to talk a little bit about a local measure here that some of you may have heard about, the Marin County Low Carbon Concrete Building Code. Marin County is in the Bay Area, kind of the North Bay area. If you were to drive north out of San Francisco across the Golden Gate Bridge, when you got off the bridge, you would land in Marin County. They instituted a low carbon concrete code a couple of years ago, and it's got some interesting things in it. It limits through a couple of different ways, either the cement that can be in a concrete mix in terms of, read the minimum compressive strength over here on the left column, and then the maximum amount of cement that can be in the middle column, or if you have an EPD available, it lists off a maximum embodied carbon per cubic yard. And you can do this on a per mix basis or on a per project basis. You can essentially add up all the volumes of your various classes of concrete, figure out the total number of pounds of cement that your project's allowed to use. And as long as you stay under that, you're fine, or kilograms of CO2 equivalent that your project's going to use either way. And keep in mind that this is only cement. So looking at that 5,000 PSI column there, 500 pounds of cement, you can stack another 500 pounds of slag in on top of that if you want. And, if you can't get to 5,000 PSI with mixes like that, you might want to rethink what you're doing with your life. But as always, the devil's in the details on this. This is from the development document that went into developing the code. And it's very clear to see that over time, they would like to be reducing those values in terms of both cement used and in terms of maximum GHG that's allowable. It is nice that down here by 2050, when they call for carbon neutrality, it does have a nice little acknowledgement that requires technologies that we have yet to invent. So at least there's that. Finally, I'll leave you with a tool here, a spot where you can have a look for yourself, Carbon Leadership Forum, Policy Toolkit. This is a group of folks very concerned about embodied energy and embodied carbon, specifically in building materials. Lots of architects, lots of structural engineers involved in this. They maintain a nice site of pending legislation, different places. Here's a screenshot from that policy toolkit. You can see that we, in California, the entire left column is just California, and then the rest of the U.S. in the other two columns. So it gives you an idea of the regulatory environment that we're living in out here. And that's all I had for you today. I think I understand that we're going to maybe take some questions at the end, but if there's anything pressing that I said during my presentation here, we can try to address it now before we move on. Larry, what say you?
I think what I'd like to do is maybe just take one question now, because it's kind of a general question that we should get to sooner rather than later. And then we'll try to save the other questions that have come in for the end. But the question I wanted to ask and pose is, does carbon neutrality, when we say that, does it mean that we are going to go to zero CO2? Is that the definition? And if so, is there a way to get there other than using some sort of a carbon capture storage? So I guess when you hear the term being used of zero carbon from the user community, what's it mean? Net zero or zero?
Well, we in the cement industry are definitely talking net zero. I don't know that certainly the technology doesn't exist today to get to a gross zero, for lack of a better term. And certainly, additionally, yes, we're talking about carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and utilization, both of which have their own challenges. Lots of folks are looking at ways to reuse carbon, both within the cement and concrete value chain and outside the value chain as well for other things. That's going to be, that's the $1 billion question, right? How do we economically capture this carbon from this process, and then what do we do with it?